Our New Testament scripture reading this morning is from the book of Psalms, number 121. Please listen for the word of God. I raise my eyes toward the mountains. Where will my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. God won't let your foot slip. Your protector won't fall asleep on the job. No, Israel's protector never sleeps or rests. The Lord is your protector. The Lord is your shade right beside you. The sun won't strike you during the day, neither will the moon at night. The Lord will protect you from all evil. God will protect your very life. The Lord will protect you on your journeys, whether going or coming, from now until forever from now. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this is our second sermon in the series on being in the wilderness. And it's been an interesting adventure for me to sort of think through these sermons, because we always think about coming out of the wilderness, right? How many of us we don't want to stay there? That's not a place we want to live. It's always like, when can I leave this place? Well, for most of us, it's like, when can I leave this place? Some of us do take like 3-month trips on the Appalachian Trail and stuff, but for most of us, the wilderness is not a place we want to stay. And so this 6 weeks on the wilderness is going to be challenging, I think. It's been challenging for me as I think about it. And so I've been thinking about it. I do a lot of my thinking on the treadmill in the morning at the Y, because it's like the only quiet time I have during the day. And I was thinking about this idea of trust. And how do we develop trust? And how do we decide who to trust, right? And I was pulling out of the Y, and I turned right onto the main road there, and I was going down the road a little bit, and I just passed the Armory, and this car, it was a red Kia Soul, and it backed out of its driveway, like 30 feet in front of me, right? It felt like 30 feet, it was probably farther, and went into the other lane and backed up, and then started driving away. And I thought, wow, that was a lot of trust that person put into me to not be texting, right? And it was like 6 a.m, so it was dark and it was raining. And I just thought, man, that was trust, right? Because I'd guess they've probably done that like a million times, right? And nothing bad had happened, so they just assumed, they trusted that this time was going to be like every other time that they'd backed out of their driveway. And it got me to thinking how much of our society is built on the idea of trust, right? Like when you're driving, you really have to trust all of the other people on the road to some extent, to be paying attention, to be looking where they're going, to remember like what that road sign means. Has anybody taken their license test recently and had to remember all of the road signs? Yeah, they make you, every time you get your license, they make you retake all of the road sign tests. And the lady helped me last time because there was one that was like a trapezoid or something. Anyway, we trust people all of the time. Like the grocery store only works if we trust people to get in line and to wait in line and to pay in a timely fashion, right? Like trust is essential. It's basically how our life functions. Now, Gallup News Service has been tracking the issue of trust since 1973. And since that time, I bet you know the answer, the trust in institutions has declined. And this is across all organizations. It's organized labor, the Supreme Court, Congress, big business, the school system, the church, newspapers, the medical system, banks, the criminal justice system, you name the institution, and trust in it has declined. Do you know which three have stayed the same? This is interesting. The military, the police, and small business, right? It's an interesting, why did those groups get carved out? Because they're clearly part of the other groups that we don't trust. So why do we trust the military and the police and small businesses? And it's not just like millennials, they get a bad rap for distrusting institution, but they tracked, and it's not millennials that started this trend. You know which group distrusts the institutions the most? Baby boomers. So you probably, right? So why? What happened to the trust? Well, they tracked that too. And they named the number one reason they say they don't trust institutions anymore is that they think that you don't trust institutions anymore. Do you get that logic? Want to run it by you again? So they don't trust institutions because they think that you don't trust institutions. So they're fine with it. I trust institutions. I don't trust, but the reason I don't trust institutions is because Penny doesn't. Right? Does that make any sense? 3/4 of the people who explained that they don't trust institutions used that logic to explain it. Okay? And 64% say that they don't trust other people because they think that other people don't trust them. Okay? So it's not necessarily that people think that other people are untrustworthy. They think that you think that they are not trustworthy. It's a cycle. You get it? So why? Again, so that's the next step. So why do they think that you don't trust? Why do they think that you don't trust things anymore? And you know what it is? Because they have decided that it has gotten harder to determine what is true. Right? So it used to be that there was an objective truth, right? You could say, this chair is red, and we all agreed that that chair was red, right? But that is just not the way we look at the world anymore. So that chair may be red for me, and it may be burgundy to somebody else, right? Do you see how this works? So we've taken the idea of there being one actual thing that is true, and made it so that truth is subjective, that it's in the eye of the beholder. So it's gotten harder to discern what is and isn't true. And you know what the other problem is? First of all, I think that that's always been true. I'm not sure that there's ever been like objective truth that we all agree on, right? Perception has always been a thing. And we've always had truth in the eye of the beholder, right? So what has changed? I think it's that the cycle is broken, right? So because I think that you don't trust me, then I'm not going to trust you. And what do we stop doing? Talking to each other, listening to each other, hearing the stories that other people have to tell us. And so how do we decide what is true? If truth is subjective, and truth is something that we hold in our own eyes, that's fine. But how do we decide what is true as a group if we don't talk to each other? If we don't listen? So this is what, the organizational psychologists study this, and it's a thing. It's called the trust loop, okay? The trust loop. And it's the idea that the more that you practice trusting, the more that you will trust. So if you've decided not to trust people or things or ideas, and so you've stopped listening to them, then you are just going to keep spiraling out. And you'll never get to a place where you trust people. And so in order to build trust with another person, you have to reach out and intentionally trust them. Right? So what does all this have to do with the Psalms, you ask yourself? Well, this psalm that we read this morning, number 121, is called A Song of Trust. Right? And it's a group. There's a group of them. They're called the Songs of Ascent. And it's all about building trust. The idea that if we lift our eyes to the hills and we ask, where does our help come from? That we will get a response. Now, I want you to imagine for a second if you are in the middle of a field and there's no electricity and you're surrounded by mountains, how dark it must be, how vulnerable you must be. If you're walking through this valley and you're surrounded by hills at night in the middle of nowhere, you have to trust, right? That nothing is going to happen in order to keep going. And so the questioner asks, from where does my help come? I think that he already knows the answer to that question. I don't think he's saying, where's my help coming from, right? So much as saying, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the same place it's always come from, right? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, the one who holds you up in God's hands, the one who has been with you your entire life, the one who has been with you through all of the journeys you've made through this valley before. From where does my help come? It comes from the maker of heaven and earth. It goes on to remind us that God is a keeper, that's God's entire job. God's identity is to protect you, to shield you, to watch over you, to guard you. The Psalms say God is like a watchman keeping guard over a city, that God is a bird shielding its young in the shelter of its wings. It's my favorite image, that God will bear us up on the wings of eagles, right? And what does God promise to do? God promises to keep you. God promises to keep you, to walk beside you, to hold your hand as you go out and you come in, as you face the dangers of the day, as you find yourself surrounded by the mountains in the middle of the night with no electricity. Guess what? God is there. And you notice where God is? God's not in the valley. Where's God? In the hills, right? Where the danger comes from. So you may not feel God. God may not be standing right beside you so much as God is looking out for you, standing on the hills. God keeps you. God guards you. God returns you home. Now, this is not saying that if you walk in the shelter of God, you will not experience wilderness. This is not saying that if God keeps you and protects you and shelters you, that there will not be times when you feel darkness, where you will be places that there feels like there is no light. That is not what this is saying. It's saying that God is protecting you. God is there with you in the midst of the dark. That God sent his Son to conquer the darkness, right? God sent Jesus to the world to die. That was his purpose. To suffer at the hands of others. To feel pain and loss and grief. And so guess what? In the midst of pain and loss and grief, and yes, even death, guess who's there? Who's already been with you? Who's already traveled that path? It's an old-fashioned feedback loop. It's an old-fashioned trust loop, right? Because you know that God's going to do what God has already promised to do, because God already did it, right? So we can trust God. We can say, God, you know what? I know I'm in the midst of this wilderness. I know I'm in the midst of this valley, but I trust that you are with me. And so what does that mean? It means that we can admit that we're weak. It means that we can admit that we need help. That we can be vulnerable with God, that we can say that we don't have our act together as much as we'd like to admit. Now, I don't know about you, but we adults tend to walk around acting like we know what we're doing, right? We like to walk around and pretend like we're the masters of our own universe, that we've got this life thing taken care of, right? And we especially never want to tell children that we don't have our act together. Because the minute you show that vulnerability, what happens? Not my children, of course, right? We pretend, we show, we give off an aura of invincibility to other people, and we pretend that we aren't weak, that there aren't moments where we need help. We don't like to show the underbelly of our lives because we think that if we are vulnerable, if we trust others with our truth, if we tell people where we are struggling, that will be used against us somehow. Or that they won't look at us the same way as they used to before. And so we hide all of that vulnerability, and what we end up doing is causing ourselves more pain in the long run. Now, some of you may be freaking out a little bit. I'm not asking you to go out on Facebook and post all of the things that are going wrong in your life, right? That's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to like turn to your neighbor and tell them whatever your deepest, darkest secret is, especially Nick. You don't need to tell, no, right? That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that if you can let your walls down a little bit, that if you can learn to trust other people with the things that are not going so right in your life, I bet you would be amazed at the response you get. And maybe you don't have it in you to trust other people yet, and that's okay too. Maybe you're a little bit too broken for that, and that's okay. But guess what? Where does your help come? From the Lord. And so maybe you can't be vulnerable with other people, and that's okay. Maybe you can't be honest with other people yet, and that's okay. But you can always, always, always tell God the truth. God is bigger than that. God is bigger than whatever you're afraid of. God's bigger than whatever you're mad about. God's bigger than whatever truth you don't want to tell. And God is an amazing secret keeper, right? So if you can't be vulnerable with others, maybe start by being vulnerable with God, with trusting God with your needs, with your wants, with your secrets. And then, maybe then, once you've practiced with God, you can be honest with others. The point is this, that God knows you. God already knows all of these things. He knows how you think. He knows what's wrong with you. God made you, right? And if God made you, then God already knows all the ways that you're broken and all the things you need help with. And God hasn't abandoned you yet, right? God hasn't failed you yet. And so maybe, like Nicodemus, it's time that you have an honest conversation with Jesus. And don't cover it up or hide it or pretend. Speak frankly with God. And I bet you it will be the most life-changing conversation you've ever had. So I invite you to spend 30 seconds and be honest with God.